Hi guys, welcome back to JDS Pact. My name is Akshay Pawar. In previous session, we saw how to create Spring Boot application. We actually saw three ways to create Spring Boot application. Now in this session, we are going to integrate our Spring Boot application with the Hibernate, and we'll be using the H2 database. So the H2 database is an in-memory database. That means you don't need any database to be installed on your machine. It would be automatically created when you will run your application. Okay, so let's start. So before we integrate our the Hibernate in our application, Hibernate is a ORM tool, object relation mapping tool, which is going to communicate with the database layer and will perform DML and DDL operations. So before we go forward, we need to add some of the dependencies of the Hibernate and some of the dependencies to connect Hibernate, like drivers and all. So let's add those dependencies. These are the dependencies. We'll be using a Spring ORM tool, Hibernate core. Spring ORM is like it will have some dependencies in it, JavaScript, GTA, and some Tomcat DBCP to get the driver classes and the Spring transaction management. To add these dependencies, Control S. So now let's create three packages. One is model, the another one is service layer, and the third one is the DAO layer. These are the typical standards that we follow. Model will have an exact replica of the table that we'll be having in the database. We'll have a service layer which will have some business logic, and then in the DAO layer will perform the database operations. So let's create these folders first. So now let's create another folder package called service layer. One more called DAO layer. Okay. Now now we have to create one configuration file for the Hibernate, which will tell Hibernate that okay, we have this dialect, we have these properties files, that we have this JDBC connection URL and all those stuff. So typically Hibernate is will look for hibernate.cfg.xml file if you use Hibernate in an application, but this file name hibernate.cfg.xml. But and then in these XML files we define all the properties, connection properties and all. Now since we are using upper versions of the Spring, we don't have to write the XML files. The main motto is to write all these XML files configurations into Java file, because Java file is much more readable and readable than XML files. So we'll be writing all the configuration that we were supposed to write in CFG XML file and now into Java file. So for that we will create a Java class, say Hibernate config. Now, in order to tell Spring that this is a configuration file and load all the configuration that we are going to define in this configuration file, we have to use an annotation called @configuration. @configuration. And we will be, as I said earlier, that we'll be using Spring transaction management. So what we have to do is we have to use enable the transaction for that. So we'll be using @enable transaction management annotation. Now let's create uh, uh, a session factory class. Now the session factory is the one which is going to create the sessions for us, and these transactions will work on those sessions in order to do some database operations. So there are multiple classes to create the session factory. We'll be using local session factory bean to create the session factory. So we'll say local session factory bean, say session factory. Okay, and what we'll do, we'll okay, let's create the return statement. Now let's create local session factory bean. We'll say session factory is equals to new local session factory bean, and then we have to define certain fields like what is the data source. First we need to set the data source. We'll see the data source, we'll set the data source later. We'll create a method for it, and then we also have to set the packages to scan. It's like these packages we need to tell, okay, we have to load all the entities that we are going to will act as a POJO for all the tables. So where all those entities are defined, we need to define all those entities packages. So we'll say we have defined it com dot spring boot dot hibernate dot model. Okay, then what we'll do, we'll get session factory dot set. We have to set the Hibernate properties as well. These are the Hibernate properties where you will set the dialect or some DDL HBM to DDL operations. Okay, so we'll create this one. This will create a method also now. So let's create a method. Let's create a method for this too. Okay. So now let's set the Hibernate properties first. So what we'll do will be will first before we going forward, let's return the session factory. We'll say properties Hibernate properties is equals to new properties. We'll say Hibernate properties dot set property. So it will have, it's like a map, it's a key value. So you have to set few properties and see what those properties are. So those properties are this one, where you set these are the key. So hibernate.hbm to ddl.auto, it's like it will tell what we have to do. So what we'll do is, like, we don't have any table already created in the database, so it is going to create a table for us. So it will, whenever it will load the application, it is going to see if the table is every time it is going to create the database and database schema for us. Okay, now set another property. Properties, now we have to set the dialect as well. We have to tell Hibernate that for a database this is the dialect file. Okay, so we'll say Hibernate dialect, and it is under org dot hibernate dot dialect dot h2 dialect. And let's see that also if it is available, if I can show you. So let's open that to org hibernate dialect. So we have all the dialects defined here. So for each dialect, each database, for each database we have different dialects. For Derby we have this one. So we are using h2, so we'll have h2 dialect. This is the h2 dialect class. So we have to define this class, set the path of this one. Okay, so then what we'll do, we'll use one more property called show SQL. where whenever any SQL will fire so that it would be visible onto our console. So the property is called Hibernate dot show underscore SQL. So it's a boolean, so you have to set true or false. So we'll say true so that we can see all the SQL on the console. Okay, then what we'll do, we'll just return this. Now let's set the data source for it. Data source properties. So we'll say now basic data source is equals to, we'll say data source is equals to new basic data source. Say data source dot set driver class name. We have to set the driver class name. So what's the driver class name? Yeah. So we have got this one is Oracle org.h2.driver. Now what will say? Now set the URL, the connection URL. So this is the connection URL, JDBC connection URL. Okay. Then we'll say we'll set the username and the password as well. So you can, as it is a in-memory database, you can set any username and password. For now, let's set Spring as a username and as a password, let's set boot. Now all good, I think. And now what we have to do is, like as I said, like we'll be using the transaction management provided by the Spring, but however we have to define some transaction available with it. So let's define the transaction class as well. Okay, so what we'll do is, like we'll say public transaction platform transaction management. We have to use the platform transaction management platform transaction manager, and we'll say Hibernate transaction manager, Hibernate transaction manager equals to transaction manager. What we'll do is we'll say transaction manager dot set session factory. So we have to get the session factory, set the session factory so that it can work. So get object. Okay. Now what we'll do, we'll write, now we'll be using Hibernate template. So Hibernate template, we can use session and all those transactions, but using the Hibernate template is a Spring Hibernate a Spring provided feature by which you can deal with the Hibernate ORM. So it will have some additional features like commit transaction. So it's better to use the Hibernate template. It will have by default method in it, like save, update, save and update, update all, save all, and all those things. So we don't have to write any methods. Basic method is, it is already defined in this one, so you can use that. So we'll say Hibernate template template. Now what we'll do, we'll create the Hibernate template object. And we have to set the session factory here as well. Set session factory get object. Let's return this Hibernate template. Okay, now we'll have to create this as a bean so that it will be loaded into the memory of when Spring we'll start. We'll do component scanning. So let's do that. Let's review it once. Okay, we have set the session database. Scan. Okay, create data source. Okay, looks good till now. So this is the configuration that we have created. So earlier we used to create all this configuration into XML called hibernate.cfg.xml. Now since it's a pure Java, we don't have to write any XML. So we can directly write all those code into the Java file itself. Okay, so now let's create an entity which will be a POJO for our database table. Let's define the table name. So suppose we have employee info, or maybe employee details. Would be good. Okay, so let's implement serializable. Okay, let's create the by default serialization ID. Now in order to tell that it's a entity, you will have to use an annotation called @entity. Now will we have two different entities. One is from Hibernate and one is from Java. So we'll be using the Java one. It's better to use the Java one because somehow in the future, if you want to remove the Hibernate, in that case, if you're using Hibernate entities, you have to rewrite modify all the classes. But right now Hibernate is compatible with will be able to understand Java entities annotations as well. So we'll be using Java entity. So it's better to use the same one instead of going with the Hibernate. So if you want to define a table name, you can use the table name. So let's say we have EMPL details. So this whenever a table will be created, the table will be created by this name called EMPL details. Okay, so now let's create few fields. Say employee IDs will act as a primary key. Will create one more, say call employee name. We are just creating two fields now. Now what we'll do, we have to generate getters and setters. Now let's use lombok for that. So if you write @getter @setter, so it is going to create the lombok is going to create the getters and setters for us. If you see here, I have not written any of the getters and setters, but still I can see the getters and setters available with me in the .class file. Now it has a few things in well. So instead of using these two annotations, let's use a single annotation which will have these two annotation available with it, which is called @data. So data annotation, if you see, it will have getter annotation, it will have setter annotation, it will generate the hash code and the toString as well. So if you see in the .class, the getter is already generated, setter is generated, equals an hash code and the toString. Now let's you also have to create the default constructor and the parameterized constructor. So for that, let's use lombok again. So in order to create a default constructor, we'll say no argument constructor, and in order to create the parameterized constructor, we'll say @required argument constructor. So you can see the default constructor and all those constructors are created. I think we have some issues with that. Okay, so what we'll do, instead of required, we'll say all argument constructor. We'll save it. Just remove the unwanted imports. Okay, so we are good till now. Now let's create a service class, or let's create a service class. will tell this file as a red service annotation. Okay, now let's create a method called public string, which will return something when whenever we're going to insert an object of employee object. So after inserting, we'll be returning something. So let's say insert empl details. We'll be passing employee object in it. Okay, so what will be let's write this one. Say employee details. We can just pass this one itself. Let's pass this data itself. Let's create the same. Let's create one more class called DAO where we will perform our database operation. So let's create called employee DAO. We'll say this class as a @repository, and then we'll write the same thing. Okay, now let's do one thing here on the employee service. Let's annotate. Let's inject employee DAO. So in order to inject that, we have to say @autowire dot insert details. Okay. Okay, it's not saved. Okay. Now let's do one more thing here. Let's inject the Hibernate template, which is going to insert the employee record into the table. So we'll say private Hibernate template. Okay, so let's inject this one. So we'll say @autowire, and then what we'll do, we'll just say Hibernate template dot save these entity. Okay, and then we'll say, and the return will say object inserted. Okay, now it looks good now. Okay. Now since we are using we have to enable the transaction, so we'll, as I said earlier, that we'll be using Spring transaction management. So we'll be using @transaction of Spring to handle the transaction. It is going to start create the transaction for us. It is going to insert record into the database. If there is no exception, it will commit the transaction. If there is something exception, it will roll back itself. So we don't have to worry about the transaction handling mechanism. Okay, so let's create a class as well. A controller is there. Okay, so let's create another method here. Say public string. So we'll use the same thing. What we'll do first, we'll inject. I will say private employee service service, and then use this one. Okay, now we'll say @post. So since we are posting some data, we will be using @post mapping. Post mapping. We'll say the method name as this one, and then we'll say it will accept the body. We'll say @request body. Okay, so we are good now. So let's do this. We'll be getting one error. I'll be explaining that error earlier later once we get it. So let's start the application first. let's use postman now. So the server is getting started. It is going to load the Hibernate properties for us. See, it is getting connected. It's going to get the dialog. Okay, we got an error here. It says Spring dependency error while getting being employed on satisfied dependent being Hibernate template being creation getting being name Hibernate in the class path resource Hibernate. Okay, looks some error. Let's check it what it is. No identifier specified for the entity com.springboot.hibernate.employee details. Okay, let's see whatever we are getting here. Let's see the model identity. Okay, no identifier specified for the. Okay, yes. So what we have done is like we have not specified what is the primary key. So we have to define the primary keys as well, right? Okay, yeah. Excuse me. So we'll say at the rate ID. So we'll say this is the ID. This is the primary key for this table. And if you want, we can define the column name as well. First, let's see the sequence that we have to generate. So we'll say generated value at the rate generated value. We have to choose the strategy that we have to generate. So we'll say selection type dot you want to generate a dot to identity table, or if you have a sequence or you have a table, what. So we'll be using we'll be using this time identity. Now if you want to define the column name as well, then you can define it, otherwise it will be created by default whatever you have typed here. So let's change the column name as well. So I'll say name equals to, we'll say empl underscore id. Let's use the same thing here as well. Okay. So let's save it and let's restart our application. So you can see that when it is loading the server, starting the server, then it has created the tables for us. So the table was not created, but still it has created the table. So we don't have to write anything. Hibernate is going to create the table for us. We have not created anything. It's good. It's a cool feature because we have defined that in the Hibernate config, saying that HBM to DDL auto is create. So it will create every time it is going to start the server if it is not there. We have other properties as well, like create drop update. So in that case, in update it is not going to create the schema tables for us. It is just going to do updates operation. Okay, so let's use the postman. So by default the board number we have selected is 8080 slash, we'll say what the employee, what is the request mapping for this one is employee details. We'll pass the body. I think the body is already there. Change the name of it. It's MPL name, right? Okay, so we'll MPL name, so we'll say let's type Spring Boot. Okay, so we'll just post it. Let's see the console that we have. Okay, we got an exception that I was explaining you about. So we are getting an exception called um, entity manager, which is not able to typecast it to a session holder. So it's a because of the Hibernate's own auto configuration file. So we have to exclude that particular file to get it loaded whenever Spring Boot is initializing the application. So we'll exclude that particular file. We'll say exclude equals to Hibernate JPA auto configuration dot class. Stop the server and start it again. It has created the table and started the application on Tomcat 8080. So let's send the request. So you can see that the row is inserted into the employee details EMPL details table. Now we have, in order to see that, we have to define some of the properties into the properties file as well. So let's do it. We have to say like spring dot h2 loaded dot console dot path. Okay, ways to the console. First we have to enable the console. We'll say true, and then what we'll do, we'll say spring dot h2 dot console dot path. So we have to define the path as well. So we'll say h2 slash console. Okay, so let's restart the application here. And now it is inserted. Our row is inserted into employee details table. So we have not defined. If you see the body that we have sent is like we are just sending the employee name. We are not sending the employee ID because we have defined in the configuration in the entity file that okay, we want this to be generated automatically. So we'll say that generation type is identity. Okay, so let's go to our server browser and say localhost 8080 slash whatever the property that we have defined, localhost 8080 slash h2 console. So here we can actually log in into the in-memory database that is present in our application, which is the h2. So let's log into this one. So the username and the password that we have used here is, I guess, spring and the boot. Okay, so go here, we'll say username is spring. So here you can run the query and then you can test it out. If whatever the operations that we have performed, the table would be created and you can see the entries into the table. So this is how you have created now the Spring Boot application and the Hibernate is Hibernate ORM and the H2 database. You can now if you want to use any other database, you can use it. You just have to define that particular database configuration properties, and it would be different dialect. There would be different JDBC class name and the connection URL and the username and the password. Now since we have defined all this configuration here, um, I think on we have hard coded all the configurations here, but we should use the properties file to load all this configuration. So um, each and Spring has a very comes with a very beautiful profile management where you can have create your own profiles, and that particular profile would be profile properties file would be automatically loaded when you will define the particular property file. So what we'll do is say, so it has a feature called spring dot profile spring profile dot active. So you can define the value here. So suppose if you have environments like some error. Okay, so you suppose if you have three environments, in that case, yeah, you can set the profile whatever the environment is there. What you can set the particular environment here. So just say spring.profiles.active equals to, suppose if you have dev, then what you have to do is you just have to create another property file which will have a name called application hyphen that particular profile dot properties. So let's say if you create another file, we'll say application hyphen dev dot properties. Now suppose you just have to set whatever the profiles that you want to load. Suppose if you want to load the dev profile, just say in the application dot properties, saying that application dot profiles dot active equals to dev. Now if you say so, then whatever the properties that we have defined in the application hyphen dev dot properties will be automatically loaded into the memory. So suppose if you have three environments, one is dev, one is test, and one is prod, and we have three different databases that we are using, three different configuration that we are using. So you can create two more files called dev and test application hyphen dev dot test dot properties, then dot prod dot properties. In that case, set the profile name, and then you can define your own database configuration in all three different environments. So alright guys, this is all about Spring Boot and the Hibernate. So if you like the video, please do comment, share and like, or like the video. I'm going to commit this code onto the GitHub repository, so it would be available for your reference. You can clone it and you can modify as per your need. Alright, thank you so much. Bye bye.